infant, my dad is in prison, my mom is a gamer, I commit arson and framed her, I neglect my kids, all this would forbid that.
For the upcoming holidays, Raycon's everyday earbuds are a must-have for any audio lover, even if you're on the naughty list, like me. Their 32-hour battery life and multi-point connectivity that allows you to pair with 2 devices at once have resulted in tens of thousands of 5-star reviews online. Their active noise cancellation feature will neutralize any unwanted disturbances. Personally, my everyday earbuds are a workout necessity. I like to pretend that I'm in a different decade whenever I'm lifting weights. Rather it be the Rocky IV theme or Stan Bush, Raycon's excellent sound quality never fails. If you're planning on getting these as a holiday gift, now is the time to order. The cutoff date to make sure these come in before Christmas is December 15th. So go to buyraycon.com/522 to save big for the holidays and get up to 25% off site-wide. That's right. You'll get up to 25% off everything on Raycon's website by going to buyraycon.com/522. There's no need to thank me, I'll just assume you're grateful. But a big thanks to Raycon for supporting independent creators like me. I am 1 month shy of my 50th birthday, and this story happened when I was about 6 or 7 years old. I used to live in an apartment building that had 12 units occupied by lower to middle class families. Back then, we used to call every adult aunt or uncle, even if they weren't related. Everyone looked out for their neighbors' children as if they were their own. Parents respected each other, and even respected the punishments of our aunts or uncles for whatever transgression they had witnessed. They didn't allow their emotions to excuse bad behavior, like nowadays. We were all just one big family. Back then, it was also common for parents to write a note on a piece of paper and send their kids to the corner store with some money. The day this happened, my mom sent me and my best friend to the store to buy her some cigarettes. The rules were clear. We were only allowed to speak to the shopkeepers, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony, and that was it. If we spoke to anyone else, we would lose the privilege of choosing to buy candy with the leftover change. With the cigarettes in my pocket, my friend and I headed back home, which was about a half a mile away. When our apartment building came into view, we could hear my friend's dad tinkering in the garage. He was likely repairing the lawnmower again. We were so focused on choosing the next piece of candy to devour that we didn't register a car slowing down next to us. "Hey girls, what are you doing out here all by yourselves?" Startled, we turned around and looked toward the car that was next to us. There were 2 men sitting in the front seats. The man riding shotgun was the one speaking to us. Remembering the golden rule, we turned our heads forward and kept walking. "Say, you haven't seen a little puppy around, have you? Can you maybe help us look for him? He absolutely loves little girls, so I'm sure he will come right to you if you call him." My best friend and I made eye contact. Without saying a word, we took off towards home. At that exact moment, the man understood that we weren't going to fall for his obvious ploy, and he opened the car door. Since I was the one right next to the car, the man grabbed my wrist, and I screamed in terror. My friend kept running, screaming for her dad. My friend's father had heard my screams and came running out of the garage with a baseball bat in his hand. When the man saw him charging toward us, he let go of my wrist and got back into his car, and they took off as soon as Uncle Dennis reached me. I was crying by then, completely terrified at what just happened. He picked me up in his arms and held me tight against him while he carried me the rest of the way back home. From that day on, no parents allowed their kids to go to the store alone. I always went with my older brother. or one of the older kids in the building. Kids didn't play alone in the yard anymore after that. Someone was always watching, ready to intervene. This was over 40 years ago, and I still get creeped out remembering what he said. He absolutely loves little girls. I still get a bit nervous whenever a car slows down next to me, and I still don't like being backed into a corner or when someone holds me for too long. I even have a moment of panic when I wake up and I'm stuck in my blanket, unable to move. Needless to say, my own kid never went to the store by himself until he was at least 12 years old. Our family-like community made us feel safe, but even back then, the danger was always there. I was a freshman at a small college called Five Towns in Long Island, New York. It is a performing arts school. In 2020, when the pandemic was still going on, I was majoring in music performance with a minor in audio production. Not many people know about this college. It had to be one of the worst schools in all of New York, and that's saying something. They would accept almost anybody there. The professors and advisors didn't really care about their jobs, and pretty much gave every student a passing grade, regardless of their academic performance, and would allow them to graduate with a master's in being a fucking idiot. I was one of only a few who actually cared about their education, and graduated this past May. I was happy to finally leave that dumpster fire behind. But let's go back to 4 years ago. I started taking classes there in August of 2020. I trusted this college would be a good experience at first. I had heard good things, but I would find out the hard way. Many of the other students there had horrible social skills, and there was a lot of other people just smoking weed all day. I didn't really connect with anyone there, but there was one person in particular that would turn out to be more than just socially awkward. He was a 23-year-old freshman named Jeremy. He was a drama student, not the handsome type from the movies. He was the real deal. Some of the students said he was a creepy guy that I should avoid at all times. Apparently, he had a history of stalking. I had hoped our paths would never cross, but sadly, here I am, writing this story. The first time I met him was in the school's cafeteria. He walked right up to me as if we were friends and started off a conversation by saying, "Hey, my name is Jeremy. What's your name?" I wanted to be very careful because of what other people had told me about his past behavior. I just remained calm and told him my name back and said that it was nice to meet him. The conversation went on for a bit longer. We just talked to each other about what we were majoring in and what our plans were after college. Once my food was ready and placed in a bag, I took my leave. I made a quick exit. He then waved and said, "Goodbye. I'll see you later." I said bye back with a soft voice and a neutral expression on my face. But I did find it very odd he said, "See you later." The way he said it was very unnerving. It made me feel very uncomfortable. I looked back one last time to see him staring at me as I walked outside. It turns out the warnings weren't unfounded. I got serious Jeffrey Dahmer vibes from this dude. I would have to make it clear the next time we saw each other that I have no interest in talking to him. A few days later, I saw him again in the cafeteria. This time a bunch of people were there. He said hello again, and I just said hi back, and was ready to order my lunch and not waste any time talking to this creep. He then started asking me questions about my day and how my classes were going. I just gave him simple one-word answers. He soon asked me a more personal question. "Are you single?" I didn't answer back. I just looked at him like, "Are you serious right now?" Thank God an employee cut in and asked what I wanted to order. I then walked out from the kitchen area to the dining hall, and I heard Jeremy following. He continued his line of questioning. "Hey, I asked if he were seeing anyone. I ignored him once again. It took him about 15 seconds for him to ask, "Why are you ignoring me?" That's when another guy who was waiting for his food jumped in and straight up told Jeremy, "Yo man, back off. She's clearly not interested." Things escalated quickly, and Jeremy responded, "Do you want to fight?" The man replied back, "If you don't leave that girl alone, that's exactly what's going to happen. I am telling you, get lost." The two men stared each other down until our orders were ready. While leaving, we heard Jeremy make a loud grunt and stomp his feet loudly, like a toddler. I then thanked the guy for having my back when things could have gone a lot worse. "No problem. I could tell that he was making you feel uncomfortable. My name is Connor, by the way." We had a nice talk before heading back to the dorms. On an unrelated note, Connor and I ended up becoming boyfriend and girlfriend, and we're still together to this day. About 2 weeks went by, and I hadn't seen Jeremy. I was very surprised considering that this whole college had a student body of about 400, probably even less. I made a small friend group with some students in my major, and we would hang out and talk about common interests. Don't get me wrong, I still thought the school was terrible, but I felt more secure now that I had a friend group. But it turns out I celebrated way too early. One night when I was coming back from a bar, I drove back to campus and arrived at around 11 o'clock at night. I wasn't drunk. I was walking back to my dorm when I saw someone standing outside the school's entrance, staring at me. As I got closer, I saw who it was. Jeremy. I felt like he was peering into my soul. I quickened my pace because I was freaking out. Thankfully, I got back to my dorm safely. A few nights later, things went from bad to worse. I was up late studying when I heard a knock at my window. Obviously, it was very concerning for someone to be knocking on my window this late at night. Perhaps it could be one of my friends. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took a deep breath, and in one swift motion, I pulled the curtain back. I saw you know who. I drew the curtain closed right away. How did he know where my dorm was? In a panic, I locked myself in the bathroom. To this day, I still don't know why I didn't call someone. I should have. I guess I was still in denial about the whole thing. I came out of the bathroom 15 minutes later, and when I looked again, he wasn't there anymore. Things got even worse 2 nights later. After coming back from a late-night choir rehearsal, I saw Jeremy pacing around outside the dorms. This time, after unlocking the entry gate, I made a run for it. When I looked back, I could see Jeremy's silhouette chasing me. Unfortunately, the gate failed to close in time, and he managed to stop it and get through. I made a break for the main lobby. I was hoping that an RA would be present there sitting in the booth, but of course, no one was there. There was a sign that read, "Back in 15. I had to act quickly. In the lounge, there was a bathroom door that had a stopper propping it open. So I hid behind it as soon as Jeremy emerged from outside and entered the lobby. I could see him looking for me through the crack of the open door. The scariest part is that he seemed to look directly at the opened bathroom door, but he never walked in or saw me peeking through the side. He then growled, "Damn it," then left. I waited for another minute to see if he was truly gone, and once I knew he was, I booked it the rest of the way to my dorm. The next day I told my friends about how Jeremy had been targeting me, telling them about how he knocked on my dorm's window and chased me. They were all shocked at what they heard, and agreed that someone would walk with me wherever I go from then on. Nothing happened over the next few days, until one night, I was chilling with some friends in my dorm room. We were just hanging out, talking and playing video games. We were suddenly interrupted by a pounding on the window. I then whispered, "Turn off the music. I think I heard something." We then all heard from outside, "Open the door. I need to talk to you." It was Jeremy's voice. We all remained silent and listened. He then spoke again. "Open this door right now, or you will have to face the consequences." Thankfully, both the window and my door were locked. My friends and I stayed cool and called the campus police, which I should have done days before when he first came and knocked at my window. As we were waiting, we heard Jeremy trying to open the door. When that didn't work, he tried breaking it down. "Open this fucking door, now!" Lucky for us, the campus police arrived just in time. We soon heard a commotion outside. "Get your fucking hands off me! No! No! Don't touch me! Ugh!" Soon after, we heard a knock at the door, and another person's voice said, "Hey, this is Resident Life. Can you open the door? It's safe now. He's gone." We all breathed a sigh of relief. He said that he would contact the school's administration and try to have him removed from the school. I thanked him before he left. I then told my friends that everything was okay now and that they could leave. The next day I got some very exciting news. I opened up an email that said that Jeremy had been expelled. It would not be allowed back on campus. I jumped out of my bed and pumped my fist into the air. I was able to complete my college courses without any more looming threats from Jeremy. I still disliked the college because it was a bad environment all around, aside from my creepy stalker. I have not seen or heard from Jeremy since, and I would like to keep it that way for the rest of my life. My family immigrated to New York from Bangladesh in 1968. It was myself, my wife, our 2 sons, and my wife's brothers and sisters along with their children. When I first came to New York, we moved to a very poor part of the Bronx, since we had very little money. I remember the streets were filthy. A lot of gang violence was in that area. Rats were everywhere, and we had to survive with no air conditioning. My family would experience xenophobia almost every day, but we never allowed it to get to us. What we were focused on was surviving and making enough money to pay the bills. I ended up working 2 jobs, one as a taxi driver and the other being a cashier at a candy store. My wife would find work as well, and my kids would be enrolled in school. As the years went by, it would mostly work out for us. As we saved up our money, we were able to move to a more peaceful environment in a much safer part of the city in Queens. My wife and I still worked our jobs, and my kids were doing well in school. The year was now 1980. One day around 2 or 3 p.m., I was working at the candy store. Customers were coming in throughout the day, but there was someone who had other plans. I remember I was reading a newspaper, waiting for the next customer to come in, when the door chime rang. I looked up to see a man wearing all black. He donned a face mask covering his mouth, a pair of sunglasses, and a beanie. I immediately knew he was there to rob the store. He pulled out a gun and shouted, "Open up the register now!" I was scared for my life. I couldn't move my body as I held up my hands. I was petrified. I tried opening up the drawer, but for some reason, it wouldn't open. The robber then shouted, "Do you want to die? Open up that drawer now before I empty this gun into your head." He then followed that up by calling me a racial slur. Then the unthinkable happened. He pulled the trigger. I thank God that I quickly ducked and moved to the side as the bullet hit my cheek. If I hadn't done that, he would have hit my head directly. I fell to the ground, and the robber came around the counter and forced open the cash drawer. He then placed all the money in a bag and left. After he was gone, about 6 people came rushing into the store to make sure that I was okay. I tried to say that I was fine. However, I couldn't speak due to the wound in the side of my face, which was still bleeding. One woman told me that the police had already been called and an ambulance would be there soon. A short time later, I was taken to the hospital. The bullet in my cheek was not removed until I was lying on the hospital bed. My family was contacted, and they all came to see me right away. Everyone was very upset, crying hysterically, but grateful that I was still alive. The police came to me later that night and were asking questions about what happened in the store. I told them that I didn't know who the thief was, or could even offer a description, as he was wearing a mask. They thanked me for my time and cooperation, and told me they would let me know if they ended up catching the guy. I was able to go home 2 days later and continue on with my life. The owner and the other employees of the candy store were nice enough to pay for my medical bills. Sadly, the identity of the robber was never discovered, and no arrests were made. This was really upsetting to me because I could have died that day, for no reason at all. If he would have given me just a little more time, I would have calmed down enough to get that drawer open for him. Today, my family and I are doing much better financially. My oldest son is a doctor, my younger son is a lawyer, and my daughter, who is the youngest, became a writer. Let me just say this. If you plan on working as a cashier in a big city, pay attention to your surroundings at all times. If a robber comes in and points a gun at you, demanding money, don't hesitate. The kind of people who rob stores aren't known for being patient or even-tempered. I'm just very thankful that I survived. But every time I look in the mirror, I'm reminded of that deadly encounter from all those years ago. The few people I've told this story to have always laughed it off or teased me. But I swear on my life, it's true. I have always loved yard sales. In the summer when I have a free day, I'll often drive around all day, looking for different yard sales. About 2 years ago I was doing this, just driving around looking for yard sale signs, gradually going further out into the rural countryside, having fun getting lost on backcountry roads. You can sometimes find great yard sales by doing this. I saw a yard sale sign off the road, next to a big rock that had something religious carved into it. I can't for the life of me remember what it said, God's Haven, or something like that. If a church group was putting this on, I figured they might have had a good selection, so I decided to go. I turned my new Jeep down the long, narrow gravel driveway, and the trees opened up to a clearing with a very beautiful white house. They have long tables spread out with folded cloths, kid toys, etc., but nothing that I was really interested in. There were probably 30 people milling about on the property, but they were all wearing these gray jumpsuits. Okay. The only other person that seemed to be there was an old man. The woman at a makeshift table with a money box on it begins talking to me as I was preparing to leave. I stride over to her for a friendly chat, and I notice that behind the house, there were 10 or so small buildings that the gray jumpsuits were going in and out of. After some casual small talk, she notices me staring. "Yes, we all live here. It's great. Would you like to come in and learn more?" She had this crazy flicker in her eyes, and I attempted to mumble some excuse. Then she nodded at 3 men who had been arranging stuff on the tables, and they all came and stood around me. Really? Come inside. We preach peace and the Word of God. I think you'll really like it here." She took my hand and began tugging me towards the house, and the three men were sort of boxing me in. That's when the old man that I mentioned earlier took notice of the situation and intervenes. "Sorry, ma'am. We both really gotta get going now. I don't think she's interested." The woman looks shocked, but lets go of me, and the men in the jumpsuits step back. We both could have been easily overpowered, but the old man took charge and grabs my arm and hustles me over to my Jeep. As I was thanking him, he mutters in a low voice, "There's something strange going on here. You really need to get out of here." My hands were shaking. Everyone who had a gray jumpsuit on stopped what they were doing and were silently staring at us, and I'm fumbling with my keys. The old man was standing by my driver's side door. I was shaking as I started up my car. I tried to do a 3-point turn, but my Jeep slid down the gravel into a shallow ditch that was next to the driveway. I was panicking. "Just take it easy and use your 4-wheel drive," I whispered to him frantically. "I don't know how." I had only had that Jeep for a couple of months at that point, and I never had to use the 4-wheel drive before. He calmly instructed me how to do it, and stood there guiding me as I finally got my Jeep to stop sinking into the gravel and drove the hell out of there. I yelled back a thank you to him, and he nodded before getting into his own truck. I've told my family and a few friends about this incident, but everyone just sort of laughs it off. They tell me, "Oh, there's no cults in this area. It was probably a church group at one of the members' houses." But I have driven around that area since this happened, and I have never been able to locate that rock sign thing again. But to be honest, that day I drove pretty deep into the country. I really had no idea where I was or what road I was on. I just knew the general direction to drive in to get back to the main road, and eventually found my way back home. I think I may have escaped from a cult that is kind of off the grid, and I thank God that old man was there. Otherwise, I may have never been seen or heard from again. So this encounter happened many years ago, when I was very young. I can't remember if the year was 2001 or 2002, but I would have been around 11 or 12 at the time. My uncle was interested in purchasing some land near Red Oak, Oklahoma. I don't know exactly where, but it was several acres in a very remote area. My father, mother, and myself decided to accompany him one Saturday to scope out the property. From our house, it was around a 3-hour drive, but we all loved riding in the car. It wasn't going to be the most eventful road trip. We just kind of tagged along to get out of the house. Upon arrival, I remember being very underwhelmed by the place. No houses anywhere around, and hardly any signs of life whatsoever, apart from a few birds. The wooded area wasn't exactly what I would call picturesque. Still, we parked our car off the road to go explore the forest for a while. My uncle was talking about buying the land for hunting, which wasn't really my thing. As we made our way through the woods, something felt off. Everyone in our group remarked about having an eerie feeling, but my uncle just laughed it off. My mother had goosebumps and kept looking over her shoulder, which made me feel on edge too. She was very insistent that something didn't feel right, like she was being watched, and wanted to leave right away. After a bit of hiking, I noticed that there was this small red shack. I had seen bigger storage sheds in the suburbs, but it looked well maintained. My uncle said that there was nothing about it on the listing, so we went to go peek inside. The door was already open, and inside were opened cans of food and a filthy blanket on the floor, and it smelled awful, like something had died in there. We all agreed it would be best to go back to the car. If there was some crazy hermit living in the forest, we didn't want to be around to encounter them. The only issue was, We had walked pretty far into these woods, and now we weren't exactly sure which direction was the correct one. The eerie feeling from earlier really amped up, and we were all on edge now. We ended up trekking another mile before we finally found the road. But we were still further down from where we had parked the car, but at least we could just follow the road back now. While walking along the road, we came across a truly disturbing sight. Right in the middle of the asphalt was an animal carcass on fire. We had no idea why this would be out in the middle of nowhere, or how it came to be killed and set ablaze. Obviously, we hadn't seen this on our way in, so this had just happened, but there seemed to be no one around. Naturally, all of us were freaked out, so we ran the rest of the way to the car. When we got back to it, we noticed that there was a large scratch in the paint, from the hood to the trunk. Thankfully, that was the only damage done to the vehicle, and my dad was able to start it up without any trouble, and we drove away as fast as we possibly could. This was definitely one of the scariest moments of my childhood. Needless to say, my uncle ended up not buying the land, and like anything over time, I sort of pushed this whole event to the back of my mind. It became one of those odd stories you tell your family members at get-togethers years later. The reason that I'm sharing this now is because I was reminded of it last night while I was watching a documentary about a family that disappeared in that same area while looking at some land that was for sale. The disappearance of the Jameson family is the name of the documentary if you're interested. The family died under mysterious circumstances in the same area we were searching that day, roughly 7 years after we made that trip out there. There are many theories about their deaths, including the allegations of some kind of cult in that area, complete with some strange ritual involving dead cats being set on fire. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but there are too many similarities to ignore. Perhaps we narrowly avoided being murdered by some ravenous cult, lurking somewhere out there in those woods. Whatever the case, something definitely didn't want us there. I had always heard whispers from some of my friends in the First Nations about spirits known as the Tree People, which refer to trees with spirits or guardians residing within them. As fascinating as I found this, I always dismissed it as just a legend. Now, before you click away, let me be clear about something. This is a story about tree people, but certainly not the spirits of Native American lore. There were 6 of us out that weekend. Myself, my girlfriend Ashley, Eric, G.I. Joe, Mike, pro football linebacker, Jake, gamer/porn addict, and his girlfriend Jamie, pothead. We were camping in a remote region of northern Alberta. For some background, Eric and I are gun enthusiasts, and we were both carrying pistols. This was years before the Trudeau administration. We had camped in this area before, and had never encountered anything that would give us cause to use them, but you never know. I forget what Eric was packing, but I was carrying an MP446 Viking, which I'll refer to by its nickname, the Viking. Clever, eh? We arrived at the campsite around 8 p.m., just as it was becoming dark, so we had to set up camp in the near pitch black. Not a big deal. We just had Eric reposition his truck and aim his headlights at the campsite. Then got to setting everything up and starting the fire, etc. The campsite was located in a clearing, surrounded by a wall of trees. Past the tree line to the north was a never-ending labyrinth of forest. Ashley set up our tent further away from the fire, which was at the center of the clearing. We wanted a little privacy, you know. I remember watching the shadows of our friends cast by the fire as they walked about the campsite. It looked like they were dancing among the trees. It was then that I got that dreadful feeling, and I noticed Ashley occasionally pausing to look into the forest as well. She would later tell me that she thought she saw something out of the corner of her eye, darting between the trees. After setting up camp, I realized I had left my lucky Stampeders hat back in the car. Call me superstitious, but I never go camping without it. My car was not parked at the camp because on previous camping trips, my car had actually gotten stuck on the hillside leading up to the campgrounds, and I had to wait 3 hours for a tow truck to come out. Not to mention the bill was astronomical. So I decided to leave it in the parking area down by the lake. Eric wanted to check out the lake anyways, so we decided that we would head out together. We could have hopped back in his truck and drove down to the parking area, but it would have been a 45-minute round trip because of how the road was laid out. It would be easier just to cut through a small patch of forest on foot. Before leaving, we handed Mike a walkie-talkie and made sure that we were on the same frequency before setting out. Both my car and the lake were roughly 300 yards away from the campsite. As we were trekking through the darkness, I could feel that we were both getting a bit nervous. I don't think we realized just how dark it was out here. We then heard something moving through the trees close by. We both then stopped and listened carefully. After a solid minute of silence, we heard another disturbance coming from the opposite direction, accompanied by hushed, murmuring voices. Eric and I looked at each other, and even though we couldn't see each other's eyes, we knew what the other was thinking. All the horror and action movies we watched together had prepared us for this moment. We both knew what we had to do. I placed my hand on Eric's back, then whispered, "Go." He charged through the growth headlong, and I did my best to keep my hand on his back as we pushed our way forward. We broke out of the woods and into the clearing and made it to the parking area. We both put our backs against my car and pointed our pistols into the dark woods, expecting something to emerge. After 20 seconds, Eric finally broke the silence. "It sounded like we were being followed, right?" "Yeah, I think I heard voices too. We're not alone out here." I quickly called Mike on the radio. "Mike, come in. Did anyone else leave camp after us?" "Negative. We're all still here. What's going on?" "Shit. Listen, we think there may be someone else out here with us. Keep an eye out." "Copy that." Eric then turned to me. "We could just be overreacting here. Maybe it's just another group that's camping out here. I know you felt that back there too. I think all of us are in serious danger." I opened my car door and grabbed my lucky hat and also gathered a few other things while Eric continued looking for any signs of movement within the trees. I turned back around and aimed my flashlight into the dark. I didn't see anything, but we both knew we had to go back into those woods to get to camp. After 5 minutes of discussing it, we decided that we had allowed our imaginations to run wild. Eric had a point. Just because there was another party out here, it doesn't mean that we were in some kind of danger. But still, we had to be on our guard. Before we set out, I radioed Mike again. "Mike, we're heading back. Now is not the time to pull any pranks on us. We think there's someone else out here, and I don't want to accidentally shoot you." "Understood." Flashlight in one hand and the Viking in the other, Eric and I re-entered the dark forest. The walk back was nerve-wracking, but uneventful. At the side of the campfire, we quickened our pace and eventually reached the safety of the clearing. While approaching the campsite to rejoin the others, that's when we heard it. A loud, thunderous chanting emanating from the forest all around us.
Morir es vivir, morir es vivir, morir es vivir, morir es vivir.
We saw everyone else at the campsite immediately look up. "What the hell is that?" Jake said. Mike stood up, looking to the northern tree line where the main forest was. "Guys, look." Several dark figures had emerged and appeared to be making their way toward the campsite. Eric and I immediately drew our weapons, and I pointed my light toward the approaching threat. They appeared to be people dressed in what I can only describe as heavy camouflage. They all looked like a legion of swamp things coming at us. "Stay back!" I shouted, while aiming the Viking. I fired a shot at the ground in front of me, which seemed to halt the figure's advance. However, shortly after, we heard a loud gunshot coming from the distance, and a bullet hit the ground by our feet. "Holy shit! Sniper!" Eric shouted. There was someone hiding in the woods, with a rifle trained on us. "That was a warning shot. We need to get going." I agreed, and addressed the approaching figures as we slowly backed away. "Okay, we got the message. We're leaving now." We started gathering up what we could and loaded it into the bed of Eric's truck. The figures were now standing still, but appeared to be getting closer and closer every time I would look their way. Another gunshot rang out from the trees, which took out one of Eric's taillights. "I think they're telling us it's time to leave now." We left our tents there. There would be no time to break them down. When Eric started up his truck and turned on his headlights, what we saw was absolutely terrifying. There were more tree people standing mere feet away from the truck. We were completely surrounded. There had to be at least 300 of them, standing in the clearing and in the forest. The scariest part was that none of them seemed to be making a sound. They just stood there like statues. The figures were not blocking the exit, so Eric carefully drove past them and made his way down the dirt road. I looked out of the back window to the campsite. The figures were now standing next to the fire, watching us as we drove away. It was a silent car ride. We all understood what had just happened, as unbelievable as it was. Thankfully, when we made it back to the lake, my car was still there, completely undamaged. Ashley and I got back into my car, and we followed Eric back out to the highway. We did report this to the police, but of course, nothing ever came of it. But I think I know why. I'm not kidding when I said there had to have been at least 300 treemen out there that night. If this was some kind of cult, it's reasonable to think that there may have been some connections with the local police. Also, they could have easily killed all of us that night. They had a sniper that could have taken us out. They could have stormed the campsite or blown out our tires. I think we were incredibly lucky to make it out of there alive. Who knows who those people were or what they were doing out there, but I'm okay with never knowing the answers to those questions. I'm really writing this as a way to vent, because I'm in a bit of a situation here, and I feel really stuck. Any advice is appreciated, but I'm not sure there's anything that can be said that will actually help. I'm going to start from the beginning. This is a story 2 years in the making, so I'll be as thorough as possible. In 2019, I graduated with my master's degree and moved to a relatively rural area for my PhD. Thinking that we'd make an investment, the intent was to rent it out once I completed my PhD. This house was only a block away from a dive bar, where my dad was able to make some pretty good friends. He introduced me to everyone, and everyone let me know that I would be so happy in my new house because the next door neighbor was the absolute nicest guy you could ever meet. So we met the neighbor, and he did seem nice enough. He suggested that we exchange numbers in case I ever needed anything, and I thought that was a good idea. What's the worst that could happen? A few days later, my dad left to go back to his house in another state, and I was left to my own devices. Literally the day after he left, it started. My neighbor texted me while I was away and let me know that he had left a gift for me on the front porch. In this text exchange, he started using pet names like Sweetie and Cutie. When I got back home, I discovered he'd left a hand-painted feeding dish for my cats in my mailbox. At this point, I wasn't that alarmed. He was just being nice, I thought. The next day, he sent me more messages with pet names, and I took the opportunity to make sure he knew I was not interested in anything romantic. He replied back with a rambling message about how all a person ever needs is friends, and that he would like to be friends with me. After that, he would send me texts frequently. Everything from inviting me to go fishing to telling me that he left more gifts on my porch. I would often not reply, or would tell him that I was busy. I didn't want to be rude, but I also had no interest in any sort of relationship with him other than being neighborly. One night, I received a text from the manager of the bar down the street, letting me know that if my neighbor knocked on my door, I shouldn't answer. She then told me that my neighbor had walked down to the bar with a hatchet and told the bartender he was hearing voices that got louder as he approached the bar. He threatened to kill somebody with a hatchet if the voices didn't stop. They called the police, and the police confiscated the hatchet from him, but there were no arrests made. She told me that the police said my neighbor was on meth. After that night, I tried to keep my distance from him even more, but things only escalated from there. One day, I went out to my car to find a dead squirrel in my driveway. The squirrel had obviously been run over and was moved to be right next to my driver's side door. I just stepped over it, got in my car, and left. When I returned home that day, the carcass was gone. Shortly after, I got a text from my neighbor that said, "Someone put a dead squirrel in your driveway. Don't worry, I moved it for you." I felt like this was a weird way to word this, and I suspected that he was the one who had put it there. Not long after this, I walked out of my house to see that he had placed an unspent shotgun shell on the bricks of his front yard. He came out and told me that served as a warning for anyone walking between our houses. For the next couple of months, I did my best to avoid him. He would text me inviting me over, and I would always come up with some excuse or just ignore him completely. I wanted to remain cordial since he was my neighbor, but to be honest, this was getting very annoying, and I was uncomfortable. He would text me as soon as I got home, telling me that he was watching me come and go from my house. Around Halloween, he handcrafted a large casket and wrote, "Here lies the last son of a bitch who played mind games. November 2012. What the fuck? And during this time, he was still sending me texts. Eventually, I got fed up with his bullshit and stopped replying completely. Less than 2 weeks after I stopped responding, he threw a 50-pound flower pot at my front door. I called the police, who advised me to get a no-contact order. A few days later, while I was watching TV, a notification popped up that my neighbor was trying to cast a video to my screen. I declined it and filed another police report. During this time, I had begun the process of getting a no-contact order from my neighbor. I saw 3 different victim advocates who told me different things. I went for an out-of-town conference, and during that time, someone had attempted to break into my house. I had a security system, so while they didn't succeed, I was aware that somebody had tried. After the conference, I came home to the entire world shutting down because of the pandemic, and I would be trapped in my home with my stalker right next door. Fortunately, the court proceedings for my protection order weren't delayed. Right before court, he sent me a text telling me that he was sorry for what he had done, and that he could tell when he saw me outside that he had made me feel uncomfortable. He then went on to say that he could tell my hair has gotten longer, and I looked beautiful. None of this dissuaded my decision. I went to court and provided all the evidence I had, the timeline of the events, and laid out everything that had happened since I moved in. I told the judge that I suspected him of attempting to break into my house while I was out of town. The kicker was, he didn't deny any of it. He actually told the judge that he took full accountability for everything. He said that he was in recovery and was trying to turn over a new leaf. He didn't oppose the protection order at all. So in March of 2020, he actually received the no contact order for stalking. Everything was pretty quiet for a while. I mean, he still did some weird shit, but that's because he was just a weird guy. It wasn't anything that made me fear for my safety. That is, until he got on drugs again. At this time, we found another unspent shotgun shell casing in my flower bed. It was consistent with the one he had previously used to send a warning. This occurred a couple of months after I started dating my boyfriend, and I suspected it was a warning to him. Because of this and for a variety of other reasons, my boyfriend moved in with me. The process was very quick, but everything turned out fine. We were still together and were as happy as we could be with our relationship. On New Year's Eve of 2021, I was awoken by yelling. I turned on my security cameras and got footage of my neighbor sticking his head out of his window and screaming obscenities at my bedroom for about 7 minutes. That doesn't seem like a very long time, but when your stalker is screaming threats and obscenities, 7 minutes is an eternity. He said, "Happy fucking New Year," and then shouted that he was going to blow up his house with his gas line. I called the police, who responded. They told me that since he never said my name, I can't prove it was a violation of the protection order. The officer said, and I quote, "There's nothing illegal about yelling in your own house." They left without even talking to him. All I could do at this point was do my best to avoid him. I parked on the street because my driveway is pretty close to his front porch. I got used to living with my curtains drawn. I always made sure my cameras were charged, all 5 of them. I spent over $1,000 on those cameras. Every inch of my yard was covered. Since then, he has been seen by me and other neighbors talking to people who aren't there, going outside and screaming nonsense. Things like, "I have Cheerios on my necklace." I'm not even joking. This basically brings me to what happened last week. In the morning, I was getting ready for the day when I heard screaming. "Someone is going to die over this sweatshirt." I turned on the cameras and got footage of my neighbor walking around the alleyway behind my house, screaming, "Are you fucking proud? How about I go get my shotgun? I'll get everyone all fired up." I immediately called the police. Once again, they didn't charge him with a violation of the protection order. Instead, they gave him an ordinance violation for disturbing the peace. The police told me that it seems like he's off of his medication again. And that was that. They left. Last night, I was awoken to a hammering outside of my window at 1 a.m. He was cutting down his privacy fence. I called the police for a noise complaint, and they just told him to stop, and that was it. As I write this, he is still outside continuing to cut down his privacy fence. This means the privacy fence only stands about 3 feet tall now. This was the one thing that made me feel relatively safe about hanging out in my own backyard, and now that's gone. All I have to say is that I'm fucking tired. I just want to live in a house where I can be sure that my neighbor is not going to try to kill me, where I can feel confident that no one's going to try to break in. My boyfriend and I are currently trying to buy a new house, but it's been difficult. I'm a PhD student, and I'm not making very much money. Renting won't work, because I have 4 cats, plus my partner's cat and dog. Finding a place to rent with so many animals is difficult, if not impossible. I refuse to rehome them, so it's partially my fault that I'm stuck in this situation. My dad has agreed to co-sign another mortgage, and I've gotten a second job. We should be able to save up enough money within a few months, but until then, we're stuck. I just don't know what else to do, and I figured that I would just write this to vent everything out. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. There's still so many instances that I have left out. I'm just so exhausted of this whole thing. When I was 15, I lived in a very rural area, about 20 minutes outside of an actual town. I was home from school alone one day when a white car pulled up in front of our mailbox and stopped. I was upstairs in my room and I could see from my window, but I didn't know who was in the car. Whoever it was just sat there for several minutes without getting out of the vehicle. It was long enough to creep me out. They then drove away. We weren't super close to our neighbors, but we weren't miles and miles apart either. I remembered that one of our neighbors a bit down the road was selling their house. I chalked it up to a potential buyer having the wrong address, or was simply checking out the neighborhood, and I thought nothing else of it. Fast forward about a week or so. It was a Friday night, and I had gone downtown to see the premiere of a movie with my boyfriend at the time. I remember it was a special occasion, and I begged my parents constantly for weeks to push my curfew back so I could see this film. It would be over well past 1 a.m., and it took about 20 minutes to get home from there. They were reluctant, but finally agreed. When the movie was over, my boyfriend Jason and I walked slowly back to the truck. It was a very well-lit, safe area, so we stood around in the parking area trying to push curfew for as long as possible. There weren't many vehicles around at the time, but I realized the car parked straight across from us was that same white car that I had seen at my house a week earlier. The engine was running, and there was a man sat in the driver's seat, maybe in his mid-30s, and he was just staring at us. But as I continued to look at him, he turned on his brights and sped out of the parking lot, almost running into Jason's truck in the process. I obviously had a horrible feeling about this and asked Jason to take me home right away. As we pulled out, we saw the white car parked across the street from the movie theater. All the lights were off, but the driver was still inside. But thankfully, he didn't follow us, so we drove the rest of the way back to my house, a bit shaken. I had no idea at that moment, but this was the start of 3 long and torturous years of being stalked by this man. A while after the parking lot situation, the encounters became more frequent and stranger, and I hated to go anywhere alone at the time. I never knew when or where this person would pop up, or how much time passed between encounters. It became clear he was watching me all the time, because he only made himself known when I was alone or with my boyfriend, never with my parents or any other friends. I was worried that none of my friends would believe me for some reason, so I kept this between Jason and my family. Until one day, my friend Rachel, who lived 5 miles away from me, began telling me about this creepy guy who showed up at her house over the weekend. Rachel's father worked on Saturdays, so she was home alone with another friend of hers, Megan. Everything was normal until around dusk, when they began to smell cigarette smoke. My heart began racing when I heard that, because by this time, that was becoming an everyday occurrence for me. I was smelling cigarette smoke and finding cigarette butts around my house, even though no one in my family smoked, and I could never trace the source. I had a nagging feeling, of course, that Rachel's experience was connected to my stalker, but I had no confirmation. So as Rachel and Megan were looking for the source of the smoke, Rachel realized that she had left a back window open and the smell was coming in from the back porch. They peered through the window to see somebody standing on her back porch. She quickly goes to close and lock the window. She then explains that the man turns around and looks straight at her with his dead eyes. Megan immediately calls the police, as Rachel continued standing there, looking at the man in shock as he smirked at her. He finished his cigarette and calmly got up and walked away. The police came and found no trace of him, except for the cigarette butts he left on the porch and scattered around the backyard, indicating that he had been there for quite some time. I immediately began to describe the creep in the white car, and Rachel confirmed it was the same man. She hadn't seen a white car, guessing that he had parked it down the road and had walked down Rachel's almost mile-long driveway, or had navigated through the woods to get to her house. As time went on, my stories were well documented with the police department, but every time they came out, the man was long gone. I have to give them credit though, because they never doubted the validity of my stories and always tried to show up quickly, as it was becoming apparent this guy knew what he was doing and wasn't planning on being caught anytime soon. We also began to suspect that the man had a police scanner in his car. One night, almost 2 years after the Rachel incident, Jason and I were heading home a bit early from a date. My parents had gone out as well that night, and we had a strict rule that we couldn't be home alone with no adults. So Jason and I began to talk in the driveway, since my dad had called and said that they were about 20 minutes out. We were too scared, given the circumstances, to get out of the truck, and we kept our eyes peeled, but we figured 20 minutes wasn't that long. Not even a minute later, we saw headlights turn on in the bushes across the street from my driveway. This freak had backed his car into the bushes and waited for us to come home. Jason immediately called the cops, and I called my dad, who was literally flying home at this point, as the man revved up his engine and flashed his lights. He then proceeded to get out of his car and walked toward us. I'll never forget how he was so slow, methodical, and emotionless. It felt like he was living out his own slasher film. I was sobbing. We had all the doors locked, of course, as the man walked up to the passenger side where I was sitting and stood only a couple of feet away from my window, just staring at me. He never made a move for the door. He simply just stood there completely still and stared. His eyes were like black holes. Jason was a baseball player and had been keeping a bat in his back seat for moments exactly like this one. He pulled me toward him and away from the window and grabbed his bat, but the man outside didn't flinch. He switched his gaze to the bat for a few seconds, then a sinister, disgusting smile spread across his face. He then walked back to his car and drove away. It seemed like 40 minutes had passed, but it couldn't have been no longer than 5, because the man was gone for a couple of minutes before my dad drove into the driveway, doing about 80. The cops were unable to track him down that night. There's a lot more to this story, such as leaving dead animals outside of our front door and shining flashlights into our windows in the middle of the night. But nothing anyone did could trip this guy up. My family has tried everything. My older brother had even desperately tried to chase this man through the woods behind our house one night and lost him. The police wanted to help, but they had no idea who this man was, and I doubt a restraining order would have done me any good. Perhaps the creepiest part of all of this was that in the 3 years that this was going on, he never spoke a single word. Then one day, just as quickly as he showed up, there wasn't a single trace of him. He had completely disappeared, just like that. I don't know if he died or was arrested for some other crime, or just lost interest, even though that seemed highly unlikely. But we simply never saw him again, and it's been about 10 years. Stalkers come in all shapes and forms, and many times they do not look like what you see in the movies. They can be completely normal on the outside. However, this man's behavior was something exactly like what you would see in a horror film. There was something in his eyes that was pure evil, enough to make your stomach turn. He made my life extremely stressful and terrifying on a day-to-day basis. And even now, living in a different state, I sometimes half expect him to show up again. This was back around 2004, when online dating wasn't as prevalent as it is now. I had met and gone on dates with a few local guys, but nothing had come of it. One evening when I was searching through profiles, I happened upon somebody who was my age and had almost identical tastes in music, hobbies, and interests as I did. I messaged him and we started to chat. He seemed interesting enough, so we agreed to meet up for coffee downtown. I didn't notice anything off-putting at first, as we ordered our coffee and hung out for a while. We talked about mundane things, and I found out he was a medical student at a local university. He seemed like a normal guy, until we finished our coffee, and he told me he wanted to go for a walk around the city. It was around this time that I noticed his demeanor began to change. He seemed to grow tense, and he got this look in his eye. He kept rubbing his hands over his thighs, as if to dry off sweaty palms. He became very quiet, and I started to get nervous. I noticed that when we were strolling, he was leading me further and further away from the populated downtown area. My attempts to continue the conversation were met with half responses and mumbles. His behavior was becoming increasingly alarming. I suggested that we needed to go back toward the downtown area, and I turned around and started to head back in the other direction, when he reached out and grabbed my arm. "No, wait, can we sit down for a second? There's something important I need to tell you." Alarm bells were going off in my head like crazy. I knew that I had to get away from this guy, but by this point, we were far enough away from the downtown crowd that there would be nobody to come to my immediate aid. I was in shock, and I numbly allowed him to guide us over to a bench and sit down. He still had a hold of my arm. He stared at me in a way that I can only describe as a predator eyeballing its prey. He then proudly disclosed to me that he had been watching me for a very, very long time. He began to rattle off all this information that he had been gathering about me. He knew which bars I went to, and the friends that I would hang out with, what I liked to talk and laugh about with others, and that he would just hang back in the crowd, watching me. He knew where I lived, and he knew where and when I would work, what school I attended, and what classes I had. He said that he had been following me for quite some time, and then he said he found me on that dating site, and that he specifically tailored his profile to mirror mine, so that he could finally get me. Still clutching my arm, he slid his hand over to squeeze my thigh. "Now that I have you, I'm never going to let go." The whole time this guy was rambling, I was acting nonchalant and nodding like none of this was a big deal, while inside I was freaking out. I had discreetly pulled out my phone and was texting one of my guy friends that I was in danger and needed help fast. One of them responded that he was in that area, and he raced over to where I was. My heart was pounding as I saw my friend's truck coming down the street. I waited until he was close enough, and I ripped myself away from the grip of the creepy stalker and began to run. The guy began chasing after me, screaming obscenities. I could feel that he was gaining on me, and I threw myself into the bed of my friend's truck, and he immediately sped away. The creepy guy was still on the sidewalk, shouting and swearing. This was the last time I fooled around with online dating. I have no idea what this creepy guy was intending to do, but I've never been more terrified in my life. I grew up in a small coal town in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a wonderful place for an outdoorsy kid like myself. We had no immediate neighbors and acres of forest to play in. Above our house was a ridge that ran along the border of a state park, but all the trails and public areas were far in the valley below, separated by a thick forest, and there was plenty of no trespassing signs, so it was rare to have hikers crossing into our land. From our house, there was a dirt road that wound up the mountainside to the top of the ridge, where there stood the remains of a burnt-down cabin. From there, you could follow that ridge to a flat area popular with the local hunters, my dad and a few of his friends. One of them posted a trail cam during the off-season to monitor the wildlife. We had coyotes, the occasional bear, mountain lions that the DEP still refused to acknowledge, bobcats, and a lot of deer. Continuing up that ridge, you would get to a clearing that had lots of flat boulders and a giant electrical tower that was fun to climb on. I would venture up there every so often with our family's black lab, Felicia, and spend hours reading, climbing, and generally enjoying the outdoors. One early fall day when I was around 13, I headed up there with a backpack full of snacks and a book. I had taken care to avoid the trail cam, as it was one of those old film ones, and I had gotten into trouble before for inadvertently filling the entire rolls of film goofing off around that area. I reached my favorite rock at the edge of the clearing, near the power lines, and had just settled down to read, when Felicia began barking and growling, rather aggressively. At first I paid it no mind, as she loved chasing deer, but this time she didn't bound off into the forest. Instead, she stayed next to me, growling at something unseen in the thick tangle of brush and trees. Now, I had considered hiking down that way before, as the park was in that direction, but it wasn't an easy passage. The area had been cleared years before to install the electrical tower. Once construction was complete, a thick mass of briars and weeds cropped up. The rocks that made for great climbing to the top of the ridge became difficult obstacles on the steep slopes below. Not to mention there was a much easier access closer to the park's entrance. This way brought you down to an undeveloped area at the very back of the campgrounds that wasn't easily accessible to cars or hikers. So I was taken off guard to see someone fighting his way through the brush from that direction. Nervously, I called out, "Hello?" and gripped Felicia's collar. She had a tendency to jump on people when she got excited, and I didn't want her to cause him to tumble down the mountain. I overheard my parents arguing about lawsuits when she barreled into a jogger on the trail. The man looked up and smiled at me, and extracted himself from the thorns and made his way up the hill to the base of my rock. I don't know if it was Felicia's reaction to him, or the rather remote and impassable way he had come from, but his presence made me feel uneasy. He was probably in his mid to late 20s, average height and build, rather unremarkable looking. No backpack or supplies, but he was wearing hiker attire. I didn't like the way he looked at me, although at my young age I couldn't place why exactly it unsettled me. But now as a grown woman, I can look back and realize that he was sizing me up. From his smile, he seemed to be pleased at what he saw. "Hi there, where did you come from?" He had no trace of an accent, which struck me as odd. Our area has a pretty strong regional accent, and we don't get a lot of outsiders. "I live just down the hill. I was hiking with my dog." "Oh, she seems like a nice dog," he told me, with no trace of irony. Felicia was snarling at him, but he seemed unconcerned. "You should have a leash on her, though. Wouldn't want to get into trouble with the park. We put a leash on her when we're down in the park. This part is our property." There was no reaction from him learning that he was essentially trespassing. "Still, you're so close. You don't know who might come this way." "No one from the park comes here," I told him. I was being a bit rude, but I was annoyed at some stranger telling me what to do with my dog on my property. I'm from the park. I'm one of the rangers, and I wanted to see the property. What would you have done if she had attacked me? You could get into big trouble. A chill crawled up my spine. We had only one ranger, and he was a close friend of the family. This man was definitely not him. But I was afraid to let on that I knew he was lying. I dug out Felicia's leash and clipped her, then stood up, slinging my backpack on. Sorry, we'll let you get on with your hike. I have to go home now. Your parents know you're up here? Oh yeah, they expect me home soon. Do they come up here often? I improvised on a whim. My dad does. He comes up and checks on the trail cams. This was the first time I saw the stranger's smile falter. Trail cams? Yeah, there's lots of them up here. He and his friends like to go hunting. The smile returned, but it was cold this time. Well, these would make excellent hunting grounds. He took a step toward me, and Felicia lunged, nearly yanking the leash right out of my hands. I managed to haul her back in time to keep her from tearing this man's smile right off of his face, but he didn't so much as flinch. You should head back now. Keep a tight hold on that leash. Maybe I'll see you up here again sometime. Yeah, maybe, I said, secretly thinking to myself that I'd never step foot into the woods again. Well, bye now. I quickly dragged Felicia away, looking back over my shoulder every now and then. He remained motionless in the spot where I had left him, staring at me with that same fucking smile. Once he was out of sight, I picked up the pace. Felicia kept growling over her shoulder, and occasionally, I would hear branches snapping behind me. I saw no sign of anyone following. I cut straight across the clearing with the trail cam, not bothering to avoid it in my rush to get away from the stranger. Once we hit the road that led home, I unclipped Felicia from her leash and broke into a jog. She remained by my side until I got back home. I didn't mention the strange man to my parents at first. They were weary about me hiking alone, and I didn't want them to forbid it. Furthermore, by the time I had gotten back, I had convinced myself that I was overreacting about the whole thing. He was probably just some hiker, and made up a story about him being a ranger to fuck with me, since I was giving him an attitude. Still, I didn't hike back up to that ridge that week, and instead snuck into the woods below my house. At the end of the week, I came home from school to a pissed-off dad, demanding to know if I had messed with the trail cam. One of his friends had come up to collect the film and discovered that the cam had been switched off, with only a few frames taken. At first, I was only concerned with getting into trouble and desperately proclaimed my innocence. I then remembered the stranger. After telling my dad about him, he called the park ranger to ask if they had somebody new on board that we didn't know about. The ranger said no, but after hearing my story, he told my dad the campground attendant had caught someone overnighting in an unauthorized area back in the campgrounds the previous weekend. He had assumed the guy was just trying to get out of paying for a camping fee. He was described as a younger man, average-looking, very friendly, and apologized for what he said was a mistake, and took off. Shortly afterward, we heard from my dad's friend about the trail cam. He had gotten the role developed, and even though there was only a few frames, the last one was of me and Felicia cutting across the clearing. I thank God that I had told the stranger that there were multiple cams. I imagine he gave up once he couldn't locate the other ones. My parents have since moved to a small neighborhood down in the valley, and I've since moved out of town. In my parents' backyard, on the riverbank, there's a mound covered by Easter lilies that marks Felicia's final resting place. The house I grew up in fell into a state of disrepair after we left, and was eventually burned to the ground. No one lives on that property now, but the clearing at the top of the hill is still popular with hunters. Whenever I visit that area for the holidays, I still like to hike up to that ridge, but when I do, I make sure to wave at all the trail cams, and I always bring a dog with me. I am a biologist, and I am frequently by myself in remote locations. This occurred when I was 26, somewhere between green and seasoned. I was surveying wetlands in a remote region of the Appalachian Mountains, in a terrain dominated by thick pine trees. Before setting out, I always go on the county assessor site and print off a map with landowner information, so I wouldn't be trespassing. Out here, you'll be shot. At this particular site, there was a private driveway going through U.S. Forest Service land that would allow me to get to my area a bit quicker. To be clear, this driveway was absolutely public property. At no point did I trespass. I got to this road and pulled off to the side about 30 yards from a privacy entry gate. My car was clearly marked as a government vehicle. The forest is old-growth pine, but the outer edges of the forest is a thick undergrowth, forming a kind of wall before you got to the tree line with a nice open understory. I was about 200 yards in when nature called. I make like a bear in the woods and do my business. Wasn't my first rodeo. Midway through, I hear somebody yelling at my truck. Great, now I have to deal with this, I thought to myself. As I was getting ready to walk back, I heard gunshots. I stopped walking. Yeah, I'm not heading back to that. I stood there for about a minute considering my options, when I heard someone coming through the undergrowth on the edge of the forest. Shit, they're coming into the woods. Again, let me be clear, this was all public property. But at the same time, this is also absolutely the kind of area where people straight up disappear, and they have before. It is extremely remote, and the communities are very closed off to outsiders. This county has more than double the amount of game wardens of any other county in the state, and for good reason. I take off into a jog, using my sense of direction to make it out to the main road, about 600 yards away. More gunshots rang out in my direction. There was no way that whoever it was saw me, but perhaps they heard me. My adrenaline kicks in to 100% now, and I'm moving with a mix of terror and urgency, trying to get back to the main road. I eventually reach my destination and hide under a nearby bridge. I call up a colleague and give him details of where I'm at, so that they can at least find my body. I then call 911. This was the first time in my life that I had to call 911 while on a job. The operator sounded skeptical over the phone, but eventually I got in touch with a deputy, and he didn't seem to believe me. They're probably just shooting at tin cans. Pfft, bullshit. It's Saturday night, 7 p.m., and he was just too lazy to get off his ass. I move further away into a public hunting area, and I eventually get stopped by a game warden. I explain the situation to him, and thank God he took me seriously. A few locals walked by us and commented about how that landowner is an asshole. He was from Louisiana, so he wasn't from around there, which explained a lot. I usually got along well with the locals that I had encountered, so this makes more sense. After an hour, the deputy gives me a ride back to my state vehicle. When we got there, we see someone sitting on an ATV, parked with a rifle across his lap, waiting for me in the dark. The deputy and I get out of the car, and I just walk straight to my truck and leave. At this point, it was 9 p.m., and I have a 4-hour drive back home. At the time, I didn't want to talk to the guy, but now I wish I had. Who knows how that conversation between the deputy and him went. I quietly started carrying a firearm with me in the field at all times. I'm glad I trusted my gut feeling that day and insisted on a police escort back to my vehicle. That was not an encounter I wanted to have with somebody with an overactive trigger finger. I had all the guy's contact information and thought about mailing him a map clearly stating where his property begins and ends, but something tells me that wouldn't matter, so I just let it go. Maybe he thought I was the creep. My girlfriend and I have hiked several parts of the Appalachian Trail. A few years back, we decided to give the southern portion of the Virginia's Trail a shot. It is about 166 miles long and runs through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests from Roanoke County to Giles County. This is definitely one of the more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which is exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail. We planned our trip to end at Damascus and figured that by the time we got there, we would be more than ready to go home to our own beds. It was early October, and the changing of the leaves and colors were amazing. The air was cool and crisp, perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful, just your typical hike. But our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the trail, you were supposed to camp just off of the trail or a designated shelter. We really didn't want to run into other people and didn't want anyone to come up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore those suggestions and find our own spot off the trail. After searching around, we found a spot a little ways off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, and talked for a while before snuggling up together and calling it a night. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I was awoken by my girlfriend shaking me. "Get your gun. Someone is walking around outside of our tent." She informed me that she had woken up to somebody just outside, running a knife along the side of our tent as they were circling us. Whenever we go hiking, I always bring my 1911 and my judge with me. You never exactly know who or what you might run into on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the judge out of my pack, and we sat silently, listening for any sounds. After a few minutes of listening to nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees, we heard it. Someone or something was walking through the forest behind our tent. I got a flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. At this time, our fire had gone out, and it was nearly pitch black. The only illumination came from the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I went to go check things out. I didn't flick on the flashlight right away to not give away my position, or that I was outside of the tent, and have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited for more noises. After a few minutes, it sounded like it was bipedal based on the way the steps were placed. I turned on the flashlight and scanned the area. I thought I saw someone moving behind a tree. I yelled out and told him to go away and that I was armed. I kept my beam fixated on that area with my gun drawn and slowly approached to where I thought I saw the figure. Then from my right, I heard the sounds of someone running away through the forest. I spun to face my light that way. Then suddenly, from the original spot, who or whatever was there had taken off into the forest as well. There was no way that I was giving chase, so I returned to the campsite. I told my girlfriend about what happened, and I end up standing guard outside of the tent in the darkness until daybreak. The following morning, I look around a while for signs of who or whatever it was, and discovered a boot print in the soft, moist dirt, not far from where our tent was. It wasn't mine or my girlfriend's. This freaked me out, as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one person, was stalking around our tent in the dark. I kept this revelation to myself because I didn't want to freak out my girlfriend any more than she already was. We were pretty deep in, and we still had 2 days left. That day we walked a little faster and covered as much ground as we possibly could. When it came time to set up camp, we found a spot near a cliff where we could place a tent and a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The entire day up to this point, I had a feeling that we were being followed. There was no confirmation of this. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else. It was more of just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some dinner. Then after a while, we again retreated into the tent. I gave my girlfriend the 1911, and I kept the judge right next to me. I assured her that if I slept at all, it would be with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep, and I stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours, just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point, my own exhaustion caught up with me, and I drifted off. I awoke some time later to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside the tent. I grabbed my gun and woke my girlfriend, quickly motioning for her to stay quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see the outline of someone's shadow against our tent. There was really someone out there. I yelled at them something along the lines of, "We're armed, get the fuck out of here." They stopped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, my gun drawn and ready to shoot at someone. Our stuff was everywhere. I walked to the edge of the woods, in the direction they had taken off to. There was a creek nearby, and a small trail alongside it. Down the creek, I could see a light. It looked like a lantern by the way it flickered. Then I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the creek. I told my girlfriend that we had to start packing up, and that we were leaving now. We packed up everything of value, leaving the tent and a few other items, then headed back onto the trail in the middle of the night. I kept hearing voices somewhere off in the forest, and branches snapping. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure that nobody was there. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long ways from anywhere, and quite literally, on our own. Since we hadn't seen another hiker this entire time, I felt that we were in serious danger. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. We rounded a corner, and I turned around and saw somebody step out onto the trail and just stand there, watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up, and there was barely any light. I couldn't make out any of their features, just a shadow. I stopped and looked at them for a second, and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently, watching us, and then turned and disappeared back into the forest. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut feeling told me that they were still there. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car. We were extremely exhausted. We had made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of cannibalistic inbred hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the entire time. I have no idea who those people were or what they wanted. Maybe it was just somebody messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of deformed hillbillies who were hunting us. We will never truly know, and I will not be returning to find out.
There's always a reason to be afraid.